welcome to another episode of the Funky Marketing Show. I'm thrilled to have today with me one of the legends and the pioneers of the marketing, Mr. Rory Sutherland himself. I usually don't present, guests right at the front, but I will do it today because Mr. Rory is Vice-Chairman at Ogilvy UK, where he also co-founded a behavioral science practice within the agency. And before that, he was a copywriter, creative director in Ogilvy for over 20 years, having joined as a graduate trainee in 1988. It's interesting to me because I'm born in 1984. So even 4 years after I'm born, he already started as a trainee. He did lots of stuff. He was a president for the IPA, chair of the judges for the direct jury at Cannes, also spoken at TED Global. He's a writer, speaker, and an inspiration. And what was interesting to me, Rory, you wrote on LinkedIn that you live in the former home of Napoleon III. You are also the trustee of the Benjamin Franklin House in London and a patron of Rochester Cathedral.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a fantastic ride, actually. People always say, well, you've only worked at one agency for 33 years getting on. Yeah, it'll be 33 years this month. But on the other hand, I've done about 7 different jobs within the same place. So I can't really complain about lack of variety. That is one advantage of a large agency, that you can actually migrate within it rather than having to leave in order to get fresh and new experience.
Indeed, that's an interesting perspective, because usually, people just when they feel that they outgrow their role, they just leave the agency or the company.
Yeah. And Ogilvy's always had a long tradition of kind of relative longevity in terms of people's staff. It tends to promote from within rather than always hiring from outside. And so it's an interesting outlier, I think, among agencies in that respect to some degree. There are a few other agencies that are similar.
Yeah, that's why you have actually the longevity, right? Because it's easier to promote the people that are already there, know the culture, know the how the agency is working, than to get the new ones right from the start.
And increasingly, actually, David Ogilvy was one of the first people to write and speak about the idea of company culture as an enduring source of competitive advantage. And I increasingly come to realize that it's true, partly because actually for more reasons than I think David Ogilvy realized, that if you have a fairly consistent culture, it allows you to accommodate a far greater range of brain types within the same organization while still functioning. I was terrified recently because I met someone who was quite interested in getting into advertising, and he's got an Oxford degree in philosophy and theology. And he's actually got a first-class degree in philosophy and theology, which is a pretty serious achievement. But he couldn't really get a job or even an interview with any of the mainstream consulting firms because they're basically looking for engineers. And my argument, this is an extraordinarily dangerous state of affairs, where so much business advice is being given by people of a very particular mental typology. That's not to say the engineering mentality isn't valuable in problem solving. It's in many cases essential, but you can't only have engineers. I always think that, China is marked by the fact that I think all but one of the Politburo effectively has a degree in some kind of engineering. So you see that partly in the Chinese obsession with infrastructure projects. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's, for a stage, I think that kind of infrastructure development is important. But you might argue, actually, it's worth noting that the Chinese high-speed rail network doesn't make any money at all. It's a massive drain on the economy, in fact. Now, you might argue that in that stage of economic development, heavy investment in engineering projects is not a bad place to start. But ultimately, you'll need other skills. And the biased tendency of, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and to a man with an engineering degree, everything looks like an engineering opportunity or problem. And so one great thing about having a company culture is it allows you to accommodate and embrace people of different personality types and different skill sets more widely. But I think, Dave, I mean, it's worth noting that the Ogilvy culture is polarizing. It's what we call in Britain Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. And people who like it tend to stay, and actually quite often when they leave, they tend to come back again. It's a recognizable cultural type. Some people love it, some people don't. If you don't like it or you don't thrive with it, freely admit, get out, because one of the things you always notice in advertising is, Jeremy Bullmore wrote about this, true in marketing in general. You know, you get people who are huge high flyers in one agency, they move to another agency and kind of disappear from sight. You equally get the opposite effect, where people who are considered and also ran at J. Walter Thompson will move to, say, BBDO, and suddenly enjoy a glittering career. The cultural fit is much, much more important than I think anybody acknowledges. We like to pretend we achieve everything we do through our own efforts and talents, but in truth, it's the ability to find people with similar values, I think, around you. Very, very good psychologist who worked for a very high-end headhunter in London said this to me. He said, you can compromise, you want diversity in everything except values. You know, fundamentally, you need to have people who share the same values. And, you know, I'd find it very difficult to work in a place. I appreciate those places, but those kind of places where you're expected to miss your child's nativity play in order to show your commitment to work. I'd find it very difficult to work in that kind of culture. You know, I think an acknowledgement of kind of work-life balance is something where Ogilvy, I don't think it gets it right, but at least it makes the right noises in that direction. It doesn't have a culture of complete corporate masochism or anything like that.
Yeah, well said. Thanks for this on the culture. I think it's one of the most important things now as we are moving to talking more about B2B, like culture and values are some things that, you know, that just now started, companies are just now starting to embrace them, like fully. It was up to some degrees for now, but today I think things are changing, and it started a little bit before COVID, and now it's moving on. So my idea was to talk more about, you know, behavior science in B2B, because I see they are far.
Well, I'm going to start off by making one very simple point, which is particularly in B2B, the role of Zoom as a technology and video conferencing as a technology, even though it's received a lot of column inches about, you know, proper working patterns, I think it's much, much more important economically than we've acknowledged, and we should be discussing it more. So I've just written a piece in The Spectator where I've made a very, I think, quite significant point, which is there's the question of whether your employees are more productive if you give them some or all remote and flexible working. But we shouldn't actually disregard the question of whether customers become more valuable when they're working remotely, because apart from anything else, they will have more, at least in the short to medium term, they'll have more discretionary income. And this is equivalent to a tax cut within the economy. But also, I think B2B, in B2B terms, it's very interesting because B2B relations always suffered from this slightly false dichotomy between it's either a phone call or an email, or you meet face to face. I mean, ordinary consumer relations, I think, arguably did this. And just a very interesting case. Now, this is a B2C example, but it's not irrelevant. You know, I chose my new financial advisor partly on his Zoom setup. The guy had plugged in a kind of mirrorless SLR camera into his laptop and had bought a professional level microphone because it was clear to him as a financial advisor that a lot of his business was going to take place over video. So he is damn well going to do it properly. And I saw his investment in that as a kind of proxy for his approach to business. Now, with a financial advisor, the relationship I want is someone who will appear on a screen and bully me into filling in a form. Okay, I don't necessarily want him to outperform the market spectacularly. What I do want him to do is to bully me into being in the market in the first place. Okay, and one of the things I noticed is I don't want a phone call. I don't want an email. I don't want someone sending me a load of electronic forms that I have to spend an hour filling in. But at the same time, I don't want a guy who says you have to be home at 7 o'clock so your wife and I can both meet you. That's too much of an imposition. And this halfway house between awareness and giving up half a day to explore a potential business relationship. The fact that there's now a stepping stone between the two seems to me, and there's a stepping stone between going to a conference for 3 days and actually watching a talk. I mean, the whole conference and exhibition industry is going to be completely reinvented. You know, if there's any business to be in, it's the conference and event streaming business at this moment. And it's extraordinarily important, I think, to the conduct of any business in this space. And we're not spending enough time talking about the potential opportunities. In a very, very simple level, during lockdown, I lead a very international existence to begin with. But during lockdown, interestingly, the number of conversations I've had with mainstream continental Europe hasn't really changed at all. Frankfurt, Paris, that sort of stuff. The number of conversations I've had with both, funnily enough, the Balkans and Scandinavia has gone up inordinately. The number of conversations I have with Australia, New Zealand, Canada has gone up by a factor of 10. The United States, particularly US outside New York, has gone up by a factor of 20. Okay, and then there are a load of countries like actually Botswana, Namibia, and Kenya, where it's literally gone up infinitely. You know, it was very unlikely I'd visit those places more than twice in my life, you know, and during those visits, I'd probably meet 8 people. Well, now it's possible. In fact, it's no different arranging a meeting with Kenya or Namibia than arranging a meeting with someone elsewhere in London. That's a really big deal, and nobody's talking about it. I mean, not nearly enough. I mean, we should, as Ogilvy, we should reinvent our business from being a handshaking business to a broadcasting business to a large extent.
Agreed. You think that COVID definitely showed us that we need to embrace openly like technology and all that's coming with it?
It was a classic case, which is very common with network technologies, which is network technologies don't cost any more. In fact, they tend to fall in price over time, but they don't deliver their benefits fully until they reach a certain critical mass. I mean, you know, to take an absurd example, there's no value to having the world's only fax machine. If only 10 people in the world have a fax machine, you don't know any of them. Again, your fax machine is more or less useless, okay? It was only when COVID forced video conferencing to reach 2 things, I think, critical mass of adoption and comprehension, combined with actually a fundamental reframing of the nature of video within business. So the way I phrase that is, first of all, you could reasonably email someone and say, are you on for a video conference? And know that they would be able to log into Zoom without cocking it up. And that, you know, basically they would make their sound work and the first 20 minutes of the call wouldn't be spent with them farting around on headphones. So there was a basic explosion in confidence and in competence, sorry. But there was also a huge explosion in confidence. In other words, if I hold a video conferencing meeting, it'll probably kind of work. You know, in fact, but thirdly, there was just a change in a social norm. And the way I phrase this, I always use the same phrase, is before the pandemic, meeting people in person was Coke and video conferencing was Dr. Pepper. And now video conferencing is Coke and meeting people is Dr. Pepper. You know, it's the default behavior. You know, if you think about it, one of the huge advantages enjoyed by Coke is that you can recommend it, ask for it, you know, order it anywhere in the world. One, you assume they'll have it, okay? Because if you don't stock Diet Coke and Coke, then, you know, you're failing as a hospitality business. So their distribution is remarkable, but also you can ask for it without it seeming weird in almost any social context. You know, you don't go into a cafe and ask for champagne. You don't go into a Michelin-starred restaurant and ask for, you know, Fanta forest fruits flavor, okay? But you can ask for Coke in any of those settings.
Yeah, well explained.
So they are, you know, to use Byron Sharp's language, it's a mixture of mental and physical distribution.
Yeah, so if we connect all those changes that we have been gone through, I think they're in the middle of, you know, B2B adapting more of a B2C behaviors and decision-making behaviors specifically. So like, I think we as consumers are not going to Google to find things right away or to compare products right away. We go to the social media, we go to the small communities because we have far more people at outreach right now than we had like 2 years ago. And I think those are the things that are changing actually the way B2B companies now have to think about the consumers, customers, and also this is what is changing their behaviors. So I just wanted to get your point on that.
Yeah, so one thing I'll say is that B2B has probably made the mistake of creating a false dichotomy. It's believed there are few people who are its customers and clients, and there are many people who are entirely irrelevant. And actually, I think the benefits of wider fame in B2B need to be restated. That apart from anything else, as LinkedIn and the LinkedIn B2B Institute have pointed out, yes, you kind of know who's responsible for buying heating and energy services for Ogilvy now, but as to who their successor is, you have literally no idea. Okay, so there's futurity, but there's also just the wider value of being famous as a brand, which actually brings its influence to bear on lots and lots of decisions where you're never measuring the effect of marketing. Okay, lots of behaviors. So the example I always give, I don't know why I do this, but if you're a famous brand, when your chief executive rings somebody up, they always return the call. The chief executive of Rolls-Royce Aero Engines, or the chief executive of a large PLC can ring pretty much anybody in the business universe and get the call returned the same day. If you work for Zog Limited, that privilege simply doesn't exist. Now, that is a product of fame, but no one really attributes it to any specific marketing communication, so it gets undervalued and ignored. And I always argue there's also the purpose of simply luck, which is maximizing serendipity. Yes, you can plan your business up to an extent, but a large part of your business's success will be always down to forces beyond your control and future elements and future developments, which you can never predict in advance. And even if you could predict them, the long-term effects they'll have on you are impossible to actually predict adequately, okay? And so there's simply a value to fame in exposing yourself, increasing your surface area exposure to possible upside opportunity of a kind that you don't yet know. And I think when business becomes too deterministic rather than probabilistic about its approach to the future, I think we actually gain in efficiency, but we lose in effectiveness. In that we can make everything look wonderfully efficient and waste-free because everything has a purpose. But unfortunately, we're not catering for anything that we didn't account for in the first place. So if you only optimize those things which you can pre-rationalize, you ultimately don't end up as a very successful business, in fact, because over time, you need to accept that there's a trade-off between exploit what you know and explore what you don't. And an efficiency mindset, driven in large part, I think, by consulting firms and these engineers I mentioned earlier, tends to overweight. The explore-exploit trade-off is known in for example, in AI, which is how much time should I spend actually evaluating a decision versus actually making it. And there's a trade-off, because if you make a slightly better decision, but it takes years, actually you're better off not doing that. But equally, if you don't explore enough, and I would argue creatively and imaginatively as well as logically, you end up making the best decision from a ridiculously narrow solution set. And so this is one of the great values of behavioral science. If you admit psychological factors into your model, then the possible creative solution set simply becomes much bigger. And your problem definition set becomes much, much broader as well. Not everything turns into a kind of engineering problem.
Yeah, and
examples I give of that, obviously, okay, in B2C, that would be, the Uber map. We don't need the cabs to turn up faster. We need to give people a higher degree of certainty. That's over when their cab's going to arrive. And that's a psychological solution to a problem, which if you'd given it purely to engineers, would have ended up with some predictive model where the cabs you try and send your cabs places where they're more likely to pick up customers. Well, that's not a bad idea in itself, but actually it's expensive to do. It may backfire. And in any case, it won't solve the principal problem, which is that people hate uncertainty more than they hate an extra 4 minutes of wait.
Yeah, that's well said. One thing that stood out for me, listening to some of your previous podcasts, is you said that that there's a connection with why B2B buyers make their decisions to avoid blame, and it has something to do with defensive decision making. And I think that was an interesting overview of the things.
So let's look at two bits of research which come not really from behavioral science, but they come from evolutionary science. The social brain hypothesis that humans evolved big brains not to understand the world, but to understand each other. I was talking to, I think it might have been Robin Dunbar, where he said, if you're a monkey, okay, what is the most complicated thing you can introduce to my environment? And the answer is actually, it's not a tree, it's not a lion, it's not a tiger. You know what the tiger's trying to do. That's relatively easy to figure out what a tiger's up to and the fact that you should avoid it. The thing that makes things really complicated is another monkey, okay? So there's the social brain hypothesis, which is that we essentially naturally think in social terms rather than conventionally rational terms. We have something you might call ecological rationality. And the second thing is the argumentative hypothesis, which comes from Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, two French anthropologists, essentially, or psychologists, who argue that in many cases we evolved the faculty of reason not to actually make decisions, but to argue for a course of action, to defend our decisions, or to assess and quality check the arguments of others. And so in this case, one of the things they notice, which would be undoubtedly an outcome if the theory is true, is that people would choose a course of action which was easier to defend rather than a course of action which was actually better. That in other words, we may choose behaviors on their defensibility, not on their optimality. And that takes you into the field of defensive decision-making. And my little oversimplification, I acknowledge it's an oversimplification, but it's a useful point to make, I think, nonetheless, is that in consumer decision-making, we try and minimize the risk of regret. And in collective or institutional decision-making, government, politics, the public sector, whatever, we try and minimize the risk of blame. And therefore, we are much, much more inclined to do those things which either don't look like a decision at all, which seem uncontroversial, or which seem hyper-rational. In other words, a lot of the quest for data is the old lamppost problem. It's for support, not illumination. And that a large part of company behavior is probably arse covering disguised as rigor. That actually the reason those people are doing it is not to protect their company, but to protect their career within the company. And once you understand the asymmetry of incentives that exist within companies, it's hardly surprising that people behave this way. Because outside of, a city trading floor or a very large bank, okay, the downside risk, you lose your job, your promotion prospects get destroyed, is immense in an organization, whereas the upside opportunity is actually relatively small. Okay, there is no likelihood that WPP will ever voluntarily, regardless of anything I do, give me £250,000. But there is there are 1,000 different things I could do tomorrow which would get me fired within an instant. And so once you look at the fact that, consumers generally have a reasonably balanced calibration of upside opportunity and downside risk, and understanding how different consumers are calibrated that way and reassuring them that, this is a low regret decision is good marketing. In B2B, you have to convince them of two things, probably, that it's a good decision, but more important, perhaps, is that it's a decision which, regardless of the consequences, it will be easy to defend the part you played in making it. And so I think this leads to all kinds of extraordinary biases. I mean, one of the examples of defensive decision-making we always noticed was what we called in the behavioral science practice, the Heathrow effect. People, whenever you asked for flights, people would always give you a list of flights from Heathrow to JFK. And you go, well, hold on, our office is closer to Newark. Newark is arguably a better airport in New York. You know, I live much closer to Gatwick or London City than I do to Heathrow. Why are you only giving me Heathrow to JFK flights options? And I'd have to go back and say, please, can you give me some flights from Newark? And I couldn't understand what was going on. And then I realized, of course, Heathrow JFK is the default. If anything goes wrong on that route, I won't blame my PA, I won't blame my company travel agent, I'll blame British Airways, or I'll blame striking American air traffic controllers, I'll blame some external entity. If you book me spontaneously from Newark or from London City, if anything goes wrong, I might blame you because you've now taken a non-standard decision. And I can ring you up and say, if you hadn't booked me from the Solling Toy Town Airport, I would be in New York by now. Okay. Now, one of the things I think we need to understand is that quite often we incentivize people individually in a very uneven way. In other words, there are far more ways they can be fired than there are ways in which they can be rewarded. And therefore, the gains to eccentric decision-making or creative exploration are smaller in business to the individual than they should be. But also we tend to silo businesses so the individual is given a very, very specific narrow function, which prevents him from having the autonomy to create value or the incentive to create value by doing things that he isn't specifically tasked, or she obviously isn't specifically tasked to do. Okay. So if you give people very narrow metrics of success, they will start actually, first of all, to pursue those metrics to the exclusion of any other, possibly to the detriment of other metrics. Why should they care? Okay, I'm simply tasked to do this. And we know from systems thinking that you don't optimize an overall system by optimizing its parts individually. This is a case for synthesis, not analysis. People will also then pursue those gains to an extent which may be counterproductive. You know, getting people off the phone in a call center, okay, you know, probably might be rewarded, even though it leads to widespread customer dissatisfaction somewhere else in the organization. But also people will start to game the system. But their opportunity to be creative has also been curtailed because nothing that improves the organization which doesn't fall into their direct area of responsibility will gain them any credit whatsoever. So they effectively become heavily compartmentalized. And this is actually a, you know, a very, very upsetting state of affairs, which I think grotesquely distorts the energies of large organizations.
Yeah, I can recognize everything that you said now, looking at the companies that, you know, that I'm talking with, especially those focusing on MQL models, where marketing is here just to get the leads. Because you measure them on leads, you expect them to keep growing the number of leads they are delivering. And so it will cause also the reaction of the marketing. You know, what we can do, we will do webinars. We can get tons of leads. That's it. We filled in our goal. And then it causes, you know, all kind of different behaviors in the organization. Like sales is not satisfied because not getting the right leads.
Well, I'll give you a lovely example of catch-22, which exists in the car industry, but also exists in B2B. If you only get in touch with someone when they're very, if you only go into a car dealership when you're very close to buying a car, okay, everybody on that dealership will oversell you. Okay, they'll give you a really hard sell because they can't face the prospect of you walking out without at least test driving a car. That creates the problem that nobody goes into a car dealership to browse because they know they're going to be pestered to hell. So as a result, even more, the people going into car dealerships are only people who are very close to the point of purchase. And so a whole value of a car dealership as a place of consideration is completely destroyed. And so the same thing can happen, which is I won't get in touch with these people because if I'm oversold, you know, and one of the things I occasionally, you know, have disagreements with, you know, Ogilvy's new business team is they say, you know, you need to be plugging our work more when you give a talk. And I say, no, I'm not in that stage. That's your job. Okay. When they come to us and say, we've got some business, okay, then you can start selling a bit harder and talking about the sunroof and the bloody alloy wheels. Okay. And the fact that, you know, okay, my job is to get them interested in the first place so that we're at least in their consideration set. And it's a different process. Now, the problem with car buying, and this is probably true of a lot of B2B things, is we don't have enough, because everybody's incentivized on transactions. They're not incentivized on interest, because you can measure transactions, but you can't measure awareness or interest. The amount of time that's spent effectively hard selling hot prospects in relation to softer sales or to simple warm-up activities among cooler prospects almost certainly gets distorted. So again, it's the exploit-explore trade-off.
Yeah, and thinking about it, do you have like any idea or suggestion how can we actually influence, like senior management to focus more of, understanding the psychology of the business? So I think
one of the problems you have is it's only the chief executive and maybe a couple of other C-suite people who have a responsibility for the organization as a system, rather than being given responsibility for an individual component. And so there's a famous story about Daniel Kahneman speaking to the board of directors of a large US company. And he goes around the heads of the different divisions, and there are sort of 10 of them, okay? And he says, I can offer you an option now. You can make a decision where there's a 50% chance that your revenue and profits go up by 50% next year, but there's a 20% chance that your revenue and profits, or 30% chance that your revenue and profits go down by 20% next year. Let's make it 30% to make it easy, okay? Right? 50% chance of a 50% increase in profits, 30% chance of a 30% fall in profits. Would you take that option of the 50% risk with the 30% downside? And all but 2 of them said no. Said, because 3 times out of 10, I'd lose my job. And if I do that 3 years in a row, right, I've definitely lost my job, because one of the 3 things is probably going to fail, right? And the chief executive sits at the end of the table aghast and said, but I want all of you to take that option, because net across the 10 divisions, we're going to end up significantly richer every year. And so once you actually start divvying up risk and opportunity and the risk reward trade-off, you start creating defensive decision-making, where people don't do, essentially, it all boils down to nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. That's what it boils down to. You go with the default option, you go with the big 4 accountancy firm, you go with the big consulting firm, because if everything goes wrong, there's a very significant form of escape velocity in a B2B brand, okay? If you become very, very famous, okay, let's say you're Pricewaterhouse or you're McKinsey, okay? If you appoint McKinsey and everything goes wrong, all your colleagues blame McKinsey. If you appoint a small boutique accounting firm or a small boutique consultancy, okay, they blame you for not appointing McKinsey or not appointing Pricewaterhouse. And that's, that's why I think, it's very, very difficult to start a small boutique airline, by the way, because no travel agent feels comfortable putting someone on an airline where the reaction will be, what the hell were you thinking? Why did you put me on this shit weird airline? My flight was terrible. It's your fault, okay? Whereas if you put someone on British Airways or Virgin or EasyJet, they go, oh, the EasyJet flight was shit, but they don't blame you, okay? They blame EasyJet. And so if you look at a large part of B2B decision-making as being blame avoidance, there is a kind of stratosphere you can enjoy as a B2B brand. And I think, to be honest, Ogilvy probably profits from sitting in this space to a degree, if I'm being completely objective, which is you're reputable enough for the decision to appoint you not to be the focus of blame in the event that things don't work out. Whereas if you appoint 6 creative guys in a weird attic in Bratislava, okay, to do your advertising, if it all goes wrong, that's not their fault. It's your fault for not appointing a proper agency.
Great example. It reminds me of so many things that I've been through, and thanks for coming up with those examples. Like,
I mean, the other problem with B2B is the price value equation in B2C is ultimately, when all's said and done, will I derive enough utility, enjoyment, status, whatever it may be, from this purchase to justify the purchase price, and is there a very low chance that I'll end up regretting doing it? Okay. Because I think that secondary one gets ignored by marketers. Marketers spend too much time on the magnification of positives rather than the minimization of negatives. Because I think, actually people take decisions using a calculus which also involves not just how good will it be on average, but what's the worst that can happen. It's what I call the McDonald's effect, and to some extent, McKinsey is the McDonald's of management consulting. Okay, if I'm going to spend a stack of money on this, the point about McDonald's is it's not very, very, very good, but it's incredibly good at not being terrible. And once you understand that calculus, one, more marketing attention needs to be placed on fear removal and reduction. Okay, and secondly, and slightly less attention on the continual magnification of the positives, which I think is just an important way of looking at it. But in B2B, you also get the absurdity, of course, which is the price value equation is terrible because you're forced to pay for, just to take my own example, advertising by the hour. But the value created by an ad agency bears almost no relation to hours spent. Okay. So it's rather like saying, I don't know, an example. I mean, you could make the example that, maybe we should lease cars rather than buying them, or maybe we should have a car where you guarantee 6,000 miles a year and you pay by the mile. Maybe we should rethink car purchase entirely. But, I'm not suggesting this doesn't apply in B2C. How you pay for something affects how you think about its value, okay? Not just the amount you pay. But in B2B, it is utterly absurd when you think about it. I'm paying people by the hour is a nonsense. And so you have this fundamental problem, by the way, which is the whole discussion around procurement almost certainly becomes completely misplaced, where it becomes a discussion about the blended hourly rate or some such nonsense. And that, that really isn't where the conversation should be focused at all. I would argue that as an ad agency with a reasonably large client, you should be able to bring them, 10 game-changing $1 million, when I say $1 million, I'm talking about a PLC or a very large company, okay? If it's a smaller entity, maybe it's a $50,000 idea or $100,000 idea, but you should be able to take them, whether they take them up or not is up to them, but you should be able to bring them those unasked for ideas as part of the relationship. And yet it's never factored in at all, because the procurement discussion is all about the efficiency an agency delivers when it's doing what it's told. Okay, but the value of an agency predominantly comes when it's doing what it hasn't been asked for. Okay, you've probably never thought of doing this, but have you ever considered doing this thing? Okay, and that's probably the greatest source of value which an agency can deliver, is doing things it was never asked to do in the first place.
Do you consider marketing also going in that direction? Like right now, when we look at the B2B, like marketing doesn't have that, that role of creating the awareness, educating the audience, but it's here just to, do, I would call it digitalized sales mostly. As
yeah, but this is again the problem, the quantification problem, which is that you're, the first lesson of statistics, and this is Roger L. Martin, who I recommend highly to anybody as a writer. The first lesson of statistics is that if your sample is unrepresentative, you need to tread carefully. Almost all marketing data is hugely unrepresentative because it tells you about transactions which are a very, very distorted part of the overall picture. Because transactions are recorded as a byproduct of the billings process. And it assumes that the value of every transaction is more or less equivalent. But of course, as I argue, if you're the DoubleTree, and I think the DoubleTree is part of the Hilton group, I hope I've got this right. Okay, if you're busy persuading people to stay at the DoubleTree, not the Hilton, then your value to the overall organization is fairly trivial because you would have got the money anyway. If you persuade someone who would have stayed, with a friend to stay at a hotel, and that hotel is the DoubleTree, that's a very valuable piece of persuasion because it's actually creating incremental money rather than shifting it elsewhere. But you're probably not making that distinction. You're not making the distinction of the value of advertising that isn't accounted for simply because the data is grotesquely unrepresentative. And so it's very easy to justify your job description and your salary as a salesman. It's very hard to justify your job as a warmer-upperer, okay? And so when you optimize around an unrepresentative sample of data, and it's, bear in mind, it's unrepresentative not only because we don't collect what's important, we collect what's to hand. That's the first point. But the second point is all big data is unrepresentative because it comes from the past. Okay, there's nothing in the data that suggested that Red Bull or Nespresso or Starbucks would be successful entities. There wasn't any data that said there's a large growing market for cups of coffee at $4. You know, there wasn't any data that suggested there was a market for a 70-cent cup of coffee you made yourself at home. Okay, there wasn't any data that suggested that people wanted a weird tasting drink in a tiny can that cost a fortune. Okay, no data. Okay. And if you only rely on what you've seen in the past to optimize what you do in the future, you're optimizing on the past. And the future is much more fat-tailed than the past because the past was only one variant of a number of what were once potential futures. And therefore, you're trying to be too logical. And in the short term, by the way, it pays because the short-term future is quite accurately described by the past. The long-term future is not described by the past at all, okay? I mean, in the case of weather, okay, you cannot predict the weather more than maybe 15 days in advance, okay? I'll give you an example of this in complexity, okay? So if you want to model mathematically the effect of one billiard ball hitting another, okay, you can do that to an extraordinary level of accuracy. When you get down to the fourth collision, the extent to which tiny variation in the initial stimulus will lead to totally different outcomes. If there are 4 collisions, it's like the 3-body problem, okay? You actually need to account for the gravitational pull of the players standing around the table in order to accurately predict what will happen. You need to get down to that level of data and detail in order to predict accurately where the ball will be after 4 collisions. Okay, if all the balls are bouncing around the table. Now, the interesting thing there is that in the short term, you can predict the weather fairly well. In fact, if you're ever locked in a cellar and the serial killer who's captured you says, if you can tell me what the weather's like outside, you're locked in a cellar, remember, okay, I'll let you go. But if you get it wrong, I'll kill you. Okay, the safest answer, if you're forced to answer that question, is to say the same as yesterday. There's about a 60% chance you'll be right, okay? If the serial killer says, what will the weather be like in 10 days' time, okay, same as yesterday is totally useless, really, okay? I mean, you know, it's little better than guesswork. And so once time progresses, the extent to which things become predictable diminishes. And yet what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict the future from basically extrapolating from the past. Now, the tragedy of that is actually that it works quite well in the short term. But when it doesn't work, it doesn't work in the medium term, it doesn't work in the long term, and it doesn't work if you have a major impetus or event like COVID, which fundamentally shakes up all the balls on the table anyway. Your best physics model of a billiard table doesn't work very well when there's an earthquake, okay? And the extent to which data-driven decisions are easy to defend leads to them becoming too popular within business decision-making. And we're back to the Sterler-Mercier point now. In their original paper, right in the synopsis, in the abstract at the top, it says, if this theory is correct, we would expect to see people making decisions on the grounds of their defensibility, not on the grounds of their suitability. And I think that the business world is a living exercise in people doing just that. I mean, one of the things you see is HR, but I'll give you an example, IT, okay? If you're an IT, if you have a security breach, okay, you might lose your job, okay? If you make life easier for employees, you don't get any of the credit. If you introduce software, you probably don't get any credit at all, okay? Now, as a result, what you see happening in corporate IT is your password changes about every 3 weeks, right? So what actually happens? People react to the frequency of change of password by simply adding a number to their existing password, okay? Which actually makes the system less safe, arguably, that actually, if you made them change their password once every 6 months, okay, and they had to choose something totally different. But here's the problem. The IT person has covered their arse by regular password changes. So they're not really interested in the extent to which this is an optimal solution to the problem. Okay, I mean, what happens, okay, I'll give you an example from my own experience. We were forced to use Outlook, okay, and OneDrive. Okay, now OneDrive for a period, they've got a bit better since, to give them credit, but OneDrive was absolutely terrible if you wanted to send large files outside the company. Okay, so everybody starts using bloody Dropbox and they start using WeTransfer and everything else. Now that's less secure than the old system when we were using Google. Okay, it's less secure than us actually, you know, than introducing a please send this outside the company option to OneDrive. But the IT person is more interested in defending his own job from blame and in defending his own career than he is in the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the Ogilvy organization. So that's a classic case where you do the thing that gives you defensibility of decision, not quality of decision. And that's Spurburn-Mercier right at the top paragraph. That's what we'd expect to see. Do we see it? We see it in medicine, okay? You know, people basically go, I can be sued for doing nothing. I can't be sued for sending him to exploratory surgery. So they send people to have some, you know, invasive tests done, even though it may not be the best thing to do. I think in the NHS, actually, I think you should be able to sue away in the British National Health Service. One way in which people can be generous to the National Health Service is they can voluntarily sign a thing saying they won't sue except for deliberate malpractice.
That was extensive and well explained. So I think we're getting close to the end, but is there something that we are missing, something that we didn't say and it's on top of your mind?
No, except to say that B2B marketing, particularly with the Zoom explosion, is now potentially much, much more interesting than people realize. It was always treated as the poor relation simply because ad agencies were engaged in the business of essentially selling media space rather than solving problems. If you adopt, you know, the approach that the most interesting bit of marketing is, you know, bought communications, then, you know, stick with B2C. I would argue the most interesting thing about marketing and being in an agency is creative problem solving. And since you see more anomalies and biases in decision-making in B2B than you do in B2C, the potential for inventive problem solving in B2B and the potential for value creation is actually greater.
Agreed. I mean, looking at, you know, when I entered the B2B like 19 months ago, something like that, working in B2C all those times before, because it was all like foggy, mystic, no humanity, no emotions, and every company was talking about themselves, about the features, about the product, not in a way that they are solving the problem with their product, but only about the product. And you know, I think there's so many.
That applies in B2C. I mean, I actually went to a kitchen firm, okay, and we said, well, presumably you take away our old kitchen when you sell us a new kitchen. No, you have to arrange that yourself. What? Okay, I'm going to go to a separate company to remove my kitchen before. Are these people total idiots? Right? It's ridiculous. Okay. Understand where the problem lies with the person and understand their situation. Don't focus yourself around what you think you do. Focus yourself around where the consumer is or where the customer is. And the extent to which, never mind B2B, I mean, the failures are probably worse than B2B. But the extent to which actually the optimization of what a company thinks it does, not around consumer needs and human needs and unmet needs, but optimizing around what you think the efficient performance of some predetermined action might be, is a catastrophic misdirection of effort. And it leads to things I call a classic form of business weight, which is not unmet needs, it's met unneeds. In other words, the company getting more and more focused on doing things that consumers aren't really very bothered about in order to pursue some metric or other, while completely ignoring what it is. I mean, 1-800 mattress, okay, that's a consumer company in the US. But I mean, they achieved something like 80% of the New York and Manhattan mattress market because part of their value proposition was, we take away your old mattress for free. What's the biggest problem replacing a mattress if you live in New York City? Well, it might be money, but assuming you've got the money to buy a new mattress, you've got the desire to buy the new mattress, the biggest hurdle is, what the hell do I do with an old mattress in the middle of Manhattan, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And secondly, if I get rid of my old mattress and then I discover my new mattress takes 3 weeks to fucking arrive, I'm sleeping on the goddamn floor, right? I mean, look at it from the lens of lived experience, not through the lens of mathematical optimization. It isn't really difficult, but most organizations don't do it because most people in the organization have job descriptions which are defined with objectives and terms that are essentially orthogonal to the customer interest or the client interest.
Yeah, and it's basically back to basics for most of the things, the way I see it. And we are just tend to overcomplicate things over and over again.
Well, I mean, we have to acknowledge the fact that a large part of the value created by marketing will never be measurable and will never be predictable in advance. It's there to some extent to increase your opportunities for being lucky and to minimize your opportunities to being, to being what we might call fragile, becoming over dependent on certain particular components. And so marketing is a probabilistic game. It's not a deterministic game. And as a result, it tends to get discounted when people design metrics and rewards and systems, which tend to be rewarded around what's deterministic, not what's probabilistic.
Yeah. So tell the people actually where they can find you. I guess Twitter is the best way if they want to continue the conversation. Keep it going.
Yeah. Absolutely
Great.
right. At Rory Sutherland, if you're interested.
Guys, I recommend you do that. Rory is very active and responsive to talk about all these things related to marketing, behavior science, and all those other things. Rory, thank you for joining me here on the Funky Marketing Show.
It's been a huge pleasure. Best wishes to everybody in You're in Belgrade, are you?
In Novi Sad, but it's close to Belgrade.
Close, yeah, I know it. Yeah, I've never been, and I've always wanted to go. So one day I'll be there in person.
Yeah. I had a plan of coming to see you speak live at the Montenegro and Spark Me conference a few years ago.
And in the end, it was cancelled, wasn't it? In the end, I think.
Yeah. The last one, yeah.
Well, okay. I think that may be happening next year, but it's April, isn't it?
Yeah, somewhere around April, May, something like that.
Keep your eyes peeled. That'll be fantastic. Thanks ever so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.